Anytime on your brother.
That's awesome.
You're
All right,
the
Luke chapter 1.
Carson's not quiet.
You what?
You're the loudest
You
person.
got burrito?
Yes,
Not really.
awesome. I was gonna say something. Thank you so much. Very good.
Okay, I know. Come on.
All right, we'll be looking at the verses of scriptures that concern John the Baptist's birth. So there's going to be a couple sections that we'll stop with or skip out on, but even though we're mostly looking at verses dealing with John's birth, I do want to verses because the way it looks kind of peculiar. And I want to explain what is going on. So, I heard a story of a new Christian that started reading the Bible and New Testament anyway. So maybe you got one of these little New Testaments that it's only the New Testament. And he reads through there, and he reads through Matthew, but then he gets to the book of Mark and he gets distressed because they crucified Jesus all over again. It's as if he's thinking, how many times is this guy going to be born and be killed and raised again? And then they get to Luke and they do it all over again. And we get to John, fourth time. So these stories are kind of like the eyewitness accounts, each of four different people, well, each of three different people, maybe each of two different people. So I keep backing up. So Matthew and John absolutely wrote primarily the things that they saw. The disciples, if you were going to be a disciple, like a Jewish disciple, even today, I've read that they will carry notebooks and fill those notebooks with pretty much anything that the teacher has to say. I've heard or I've read that the disciples will even take the teacher into the restroom with the notebooks handy, just in case the teacher says something profound while in the bathroom, which does seem awkward to me. But because they are so meticulous and so, so adamant about recording everything, you can look at, say, Matthew in chapters 4, 5, 6, and there is just a huge swath of red letters, which is from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. How do they know? How does somebody know exactly everything they've said? Because there were probably multiple people that were right there in the audience writing down everything that he was saying. And most of that, or a good chunk of that, got recorded in the Gospels. Likewise with John, you start reading around chapters 14, 15, 16 of St. John, and here's this big, huge conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples at the Last Supper, right before he gets crucified and all that. There's even details of the prayers that Jesus prayed. Where's all that come from? Probably John getting out his notebooks and looking back to see everything that Jesus prayed. And chances are he didn't even include all of it here. Just bits and pieces, and the highlights are included in our Gospel of John. So Matthew and John, they were there when Jesus was doing the teaching. They heard the teaching. They took the notes, and a lot of these Gospels are from their notes. Mark may or may not have been there. He wasn't one of the 12 disciples, but he was a traveling buddy with Peter. And the scholars say that the Gospel of Mark is a lot of the stuff that Peter told to Mark. And then Mark wrote this down in a letter, sent it out like a book. Each one of these four Gospels, Gospel means good news, but each one of the four would have been initially published as an individual. So Matthew writes, an eyewitness account of Jesus Christ, whatever he wants to call it. We call it, the Gospel according to Matthew now, but it was initially published as a long letter or a short book, and it's just his story. Mark publishes one based on what Peter tells him. John publishes one based on his own notes. Luke, though, is a bit of a historian. Whether he was there when Jesus was doing the initial teaching, we don't know. But it appears that he was contracted, somebody hired him to investigate the stories and write down a history of what happened. And the thing happened twice. It happened with the Gospel of Luke, happened with the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, some parts are actually an eyewitness account, and Luke will write, we went here, here we did this, this other thing. Some of those pronouns, but for the most part of it, it's just a history. So, in Luke's version of the life and times of Jesus Christ, or the good news, the gospel according to Luke, he starts off with this opening. He's writing to Theophilus and saying, for his much taken in hand, set forth in, this almost sounds, the way it's written almost sounds like the Gettysburg Address. Our forefathers said, take it in hand. A lot of other people have tried to write a gospel. There's possibly at the time this goes out, maybe you'd already heard of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. There's also it's not included in our Bibles, but there were other bits and pieces. There were other Gospels that were published around that time. One can still find the Gospel of Peter, although it's got some crazy stuff in there that some people say, well, this is probably not really written by Peter, because Peter's into it within Mark's Gospel. But it is interesting to read. One of the interesting things in the Gospel of Peter is that when the stone rolls away, a cross comes floating out of the tomb, which, I'm thinking, probably not.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, it sounds cool, but that's the reason it's not in our scripture, because people smarter than me looked at that and said, probably not.
Right.
Anyway, a lot of people try to put statements together, testimonies of the things that we all believe, the things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So that one, verse 2 says, we've got our hands on some of these testimonies. Those of us that actually saw what happened, those of us that did the preaching. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus. Theophilus means friend of God. Theophilus is the guy that paid the money for Luke to do the writing. And so Luke is just saying, it seemed like a good idea that I would write all this stuff down so that you could know the certainty of those things wherein you have been instructed. So that's all the preamble to Luke. I don't know that it's terribly important, but I do remember ages ago in the 1980s, I had thought about being on a Bible quiz. 4 verses were something I had to memorize, but I don't know why. Our story and our study about John the Baptist is going to start in verse 5. There were multiple people named John. We have in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Gospels. That John was John the disciple. He was the brother of James. Quite possibly, he was almost assuredly, he was the same John that wrote the letters at the back, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John. And he's most probably also the John that wrote the book of Revelation. There are some that say they were different Johns. John was a fairly common name, maybe not the most common name, but it's common enough that you could have a whole bunch of people named John, just like there's a bunch of people named Brittany, or Deb, or Terry, or whatever. So just because you see a guy named John, it doesn't mean it's the same guy named John as every other place that you see in Scripture that you see John. John the Baptist, named because he did a lot of baptizing, he absolutely, certainly could not have been the same John that wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the one that had the Revelation, because John the Baptist was executed before Jesus was even crucified. A guy named Herod ordered that his head be chopped off. Since he died so early, he could not have written all those other things. All right. So verse 5, there was, in the days of Herod, the king of Judea. Judea is a nickname of the area that most of the Jews lived in. There was a certain priest named Zachariah of the house of Abiah. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron. her name was Elizabeth. All right. So two things of background. Number one, the guy's a priest. All the priests had to be descended from the tribe of Levi. Jacob from the Old Testament had 12 sons, one of which was named Levi. That tribe is what all the priests came from. There was also within that family a finer lineage of people that descended from Aaron. So there were some Levites that were not from Aaron, and there were some Levites that came from Aaron. Just like we might have, Americans today that came from the family line of Washington, first president. And you got Americans today that did not come from the family of Washington. So you've got Levites that came from Aaron, Levites that did not. Zechariah did not, but his wife did. That's all it's saying. They were both righteous before God. They were walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. They had no child because Elizabeth was barren. She wasn't able to have children. I would suppose that I'm thinking every time Scripture talks about somebody being unable to have children, it always says that the wife is barren. I know that in some countries, in Honduras, we went to Honduras and with a ministry friend, some friends of ours that were in our church in Angola. They were unable to have kids because the wife, the husband had been injured as a child. And when this couple mentioned that they were unable to have kids, the Honduran people felt sorry for the wife and wanted to pray for her. And I think it can be somewhat customary that people assume if there's no children, then the problem is with the wife. It could, but because this is Scripture, and because I consider Scripture to be not only accurate historically, but also inspired by God, I will put my foot out there and say that in this case, because Scripture says that Elizabeth was barren, that the problem would have been there. And now here's Zechariah and Elizabeth, and it says they are well stricken in years. I don't know how old that is, but old enough. I did not even look to see what, I'm sure there's somebody that has ideas about how old they are, but it doesn't. Those are just ideas.
In verse number 5, I think it's really interesting there where it says that certain precincts Zechariah of the my Bible says the course, you said the house, the course of Abiah, and it's back in
Mine says course too. I probably misread that.
Back in First Chronicles chapter 24, it talks about the course of Elijah.
Okay.
That Zechariah was out of. It's really interesting to study that.
Mine says division.
Division, class, course, I think would all kind of be the same thing.
So if you study in First Chronicles, they had like all these courses that the priests, they had to serve like 2 weeks out of the year into the holies of holies things, and it gives you the timeline. And if you go and you study this all out,